I'm Ron Lichty. I have been in my career a programmer and also a product manager and also a product marketing manager, and I also managed a lot of parts of product delivery organizations, from programmers to QA people to product managers to project managers to kind of the gamut of the product development world. These are some of the companies I've been with. I was originally a programmer, and when I came into the programming world, I was originally a programmer. I wrote compiler code generators. I wrote embedded microcontroller software. I wrote word processing software on personal computers. We did entertainment and multimedia software. I've got a couple of patents on embedded microcontroller stuff. And I've written a couple of books on programming in assembly language. I wrote those a long time ago. And I hadn't written a book for a long time. When I wrote another one, I'll talk to you for a moment about that. About a little over 20 years ago, Apple Computer, I'd been programming for about 7 years, and Apple Computer gave me an opportunity to segue my career to become a manager for the first time, and to become a product manager for the first time, and to become a product marketing manager for the first time, and to become a manager of product managers. And I did that for about 2 years, and when that job came to a conclusion, so we were doing product management of development tools at Apple, and when that came to a conclusion, I had the experience that a lot of programmers have of, well, do I really want to be a manager, and then do I want to be in product management? Holy cow, done that for 2 years. I went back to being a programmer, only 3 months later for Apple to make me a manager of the team that I was in. And I actually did that one more time. I went back to being a programmer again, and Apple made me a manager again, and I finally said, okay, I got it. You guys want me to be a manager, but I actually was at that point experiencing some real fun being a manager and experiencing the breadth that managers get that programmers don't get, and the opportunity of working with the organization in ways that they don't. And since Apple, I have managed programmers and project managers and product managers and directors of engineering, and I've managed a lot of the organization. I've managed both teams and organizations. I've been a manager, I've been a director of engineering, I've been a VP of engineering, I've been a VP of products, I've been a CTO. And over the past decade, I've been alternating back and forth between managing software organizations and consulting with organizations to help bring best practices and teaching best practices into organizations that are struggling to transform chaos to clarity and make software development home. So I want to know a little bit about you. So we're going to do an exercise, and this is a movement exercise. So if you've got something on your lap, you're going to put it on your chair, probably, because I think everybody here is going to stand up. And I don't know what I'm going to do with the person who's already standing up. So I want a census of the room. So I want those of you who've never had the word manager and a title to stand up right now. Oh, good. Thank you. All right. So 2 people have never had the word manager in their title. Okay, so now the word manager, you can sit back down. The word manager is used in multiple ways. So we have product managers and program managers and project managers and product marketing managers. So my belief is that a lot of people in this room are product managers. So if you're a product manager, stand up. Okay, so we've got 5 people standing. All right, so my co-author and I wrote our book. Who we targeted were managers of programmers. So if you are now or have ever managed programmers and programming teams, please stand up. We have some of the same people. All right. All right, and we have to think about it. That's good. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Okay, about. Now stay standing. Those of you, because those of you who've had, if you've had a day or more of training in management, whether it's on your own or through college or through your work, stay standing. About half the people just sat down. That's been my experience as well. So if you got your training before you became a manager, stay standing. I'm just sure. Okay, you can sit down. I won't leave you being uncomfortable any longer.
You're the only one who had preparation before you
So isn't it interesting how we expect programmers to get a lot of training to become programmers, to have a lot of experience becoming programmers, but we become managers with no training and no learning and no experience. So that's what led my co-author, Mickey Mantle, and I to write this book, because that was our experience. Both of us got tapped to be managers. I got tapped by Apple, he got tapped, I think it was before Pixar, I think it was the company before Pixar, but he got tapped to be a manager, and neither one of us had training beforehand. And that's the typical situation, the same situation as you've had in this room. And we thought that if we put together the experience that we'd gotten after the fact and shared it in a book, that would have some real value. And so that was one of the drivers that led us to write this book. A second driver was a notion of rules of thumb. So Mickey, when I met Mickey, he was the VP of Engineering at Broderbund, which was the name in entertainment and kids software 16, 18 years ago. And I was heading up entertainment development at Berkeley Systems, which did screensavers and games. We did After Dark, we did flying toasters, we did fish, swim across your screen, it saved your screen, and entertained you in the meantime. And we met, and we thought, we got to know each other and really liked each other and started having breakfast every month or two. We would get together on a Saturday for breakfast, and we found ourselves sharing solutions for these challenges of managing software development. And we found one of the things we were doing was sharing rules of thumb that we or some of our colleagues and peers were using to do that. So I've sprinkled some rules of thumb through this, so I want to share what I mean by rules of thumb. So this is a 1700s rule of thumb. This is not from Ben Franklin, it's from a contemporary of his who published a whole set of rules of thumb at the time, the 1700s. Measure twice, cut once is 250 years old. But, and as malleable as software is, I'm guessing that there are some of you in this room who have thought, I wish we measured twice before we cut. But probably nobody as much as the Mars Orbiter team, the Mars Climate Orbiter team, who programmed their satellite in metric system and then sent it English units, causing it to crash into the atmosphere of Mars and disintegrate on the way down. Another rule of thumb, I really like this one. Life is simpler when you plow around the stump. Now, if you think about the organizations you've been in, you will remember that there are some of them that have bad practices that are so deeply rooted that it's a lot easier to introduce learning and to introduce best practices by going around those best practices, those bad practices, than trying to go through them. Well, one of the rules of thumb that both Mickey and I found caused us to start collecting rules of thumb around software development was this one, Brooks' Law. This is from the 1960s. This is from the IBM 360 mainframe operating system development that Fred Brooks was the project manager on. I had the blessing to hear Fred Brooks talk about 2 years ago. He's in his 80s now, absolutely as sharp as he was in the 1960s and brilliant with his insights. He wrote The Mythical Man Month, that's where this came from, and if you haven't read The Mythical Man Month, go read it. It is an absolute classic. But these are all rules of thumb, and so these are the kinds of things that I'm talking about. So, here's what I'm going to talk about tonight. One of the things about, we put out the advance on this to say, you know, what's a great programming manager, and how do you work with them, and how do you communicate with them, and that kind of thing. One of the interesting things about programming managers is that it's, everybody heard the parable of the 3 blind guys and the elephant? I'm seeing a couple of, what?
I use a picture to actually describe how product management is thought of with 6 blind men.
6 blind men.
Different places.
Yeah. So the parable is that there are 3 blind men who are asked to describe what an elephant is, and one of them is holding the trunk, one of them is holding a leg, one of them is holding the tail, and they all describe the elephant completely differently. And that's sort of how you get descriptions of programming managers. If you ask programmers, they will tell you that what a programmer does is they manage people like me. They manage teams of people like me. If you ask product managers, they're more likely to say this first one. It's about managing delivery. If you ask other groups of people in the organization, they'll have different, if you ask QA manager, I'm not going to tell you what QA managers say about development managers. But so what I'm going to talk about, so what I want to do is to step behind the curtain and talk about some of the other things that programming managers do. And I'm going to talk about them because in some cases, product managers have the same challenges. In some cases, they are opportunities for product managers to understand programming managers and engage with them. And in other cases, when we get down to managing out and up, we'll talk about collaboration between the whole gamut across the product delivery organization. So we've got an exercise first, and I had a slide set running, so hopefully all of you have thought about it, so I'm only going to give you 60 seconds of quiet to think about this and to write down, so I'm going to have you call out 1 or 2 words that represent the best manager you ever worked with. A word or 2 that calls out their skills or their behaviors or their finesse or their gifts of greatness that made them stand out. So take 60 seconds, think about that, and then my 2 loyal assistants here, Nick and Jean, will write down your word or words. I'll give you 1, I'll give you 1, and I'll give you each a magic marker.
Oh, there you go. All right. Gee, Grease's daughter and thinks they're working.
There's a long programming manager. Yeah, so it should be the best programming manager you ever worked with. Sorry. I meant to say that.
So do you want us to just start yelling words, or how do you want this done?
All right, so everybody got a thought in their head? Anybody need more time? So yes, you sounds like you've got one.
Sure, compassion.
Show compassion. Okay. Another one?
Easy to talk to.
Easy to talk to.
Organized.
Organized. Now we have to allow our assistants to catch up. All right. So I'm going to pull this off the top, and we're going to put them up here. All right. Another one.
Vision.
Vision. They have vision.
They can communicate the vision. They don't just have it.
Communicate vision.
Innovative.
Innovative. Hold up. We have to catch up. Innovative. Oh, no. We need yours too. We need yours too. We need vision and communicate vision. They're both valid. All right, next one.
Knew the details. Knew the details. He understood all the details.
Understood the details.
All of them.
Protected the team.
Know the details. Got it. Okay, sorry.
Protected the team from the
Mudslide of upper management shit.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So that's management.
Shielded the team. Shielded the team. What do we not earn? All right.
Could both
One more.
challenge people and then understand when they were past their boundaries of capabilities.
Uh-huh. No team edges. How's
Yeah.
that?
Didn't see the gas on.
All right, good. All right, and that's it. So so we've already got a recipe up here for a great manager. You all know what a great manager looks like. All right? So
How about isn't lazy?
isn't lazy.
That's not just for
Keep
managers.
that in the positive way.
That doesn't get to great, that only gets to not terrible, I think.
Can you see that's
All right, so-
anyway?
Yeah, okay, so we're gonna stick with these. So here are a few that Mickey and I wrote about in the book. Always recruiting. Well, I'm gonna talk about that later, because that's actually a rule of thumb. They seek to collaborate with the rest of the organization. They're listeners. We get listener up here? Communicate, but we'll talk about communicating in a minute. And listening, Cindy mentioned this one, almost a psychologist's understanding of coders. The ability to motivate, dealing with problem employees, clear alignment of team and purpose, infectious enthusiasm that brings it all together. And sort of all of those together adding up to delivering. So where I want to start, moving on from this, is challenges for new programmers. So new programming managers, sorry. So the challenge that programming managers, there's a rule of thumb that I learned, took me a while, that when you transition up the ladder, what worked for you at the level that you were at suddenly is in your way. So I'll give you a couple of examples of this. One of them is that you've been, being a great programmer is an introverted kind of experience. It's being able to shut out the world. It's being able to climb into the microprocessor and listen to the gates open and close. Being a great programming manager, one of the pieces of it is protecting the team, shielding them. You're suddenly going from shielding yourself to shielding a whole group of people. And what do you have to do that? You have to be extroverted. So extroverted, not only do you put a welcome mat outside your door of your cube, but you invite interruptions. Now take your average programmer and say, now tomorrow I want you to be the manager and I want you to invite interruptions in your life. But you invite interruptions for a reason, because the interruptions are typically telling you about what's wrong, about what's going on with the software, about that person may never come back to tell you that again unless you accept that interruption at the moment. So it's one of the rules that I learned the hard way is and the same thing's true of going from a first level manager to a higher level manager. First level manager protects the team, they're a shield. You go up a level and you are totally about collaborating with senior management. Does not have to do, you've got a manager working for you who protects the team. Your job is to collaborate. And that gets in your way. The thing about managing is that you are probably one of the best coders on your team. The odd thing is that organizations take the best programmers in the organization and say, you be the manager. The other odd thing is that they then have to say, I'm going to assign the work to somebody who's not the best programmer because I know I'm the best programmer. And for sure, if there's a better programmer, there are some that are not. And that's a hard thing to do. So there's a gamut of management, there's a continuum, and it runs from delegates right smack in the middle. On one side is micromanagement, and on the other side is dumping tasks. So on one side is micromanagement, where you care about and you tell people how to do things right down to the detail. On the other side is dumping, where you don't tell anybody anything at all. And typically, in my experience, programming managers are one or the other. They do not do very much of this. They're one or the other because their managers were one or the other, and that's where they learned to be managers. So my managers, almost to a one, my managers were dumpers. The first manager I had as a programmer came in the door and said, your task is to take this program, which was written in an assembly language you've never seen before. It's like one you know, though, but you've never seen it. And you're going to translate it into another language, a higher level language, which you've also never seen before. And by the way, you haven't got a whole lot of experience with higher level languages anyway, other than BASIC, which doesn't count as the higher level language. And by the way, I'm going to Phoenix. I'll be back in 2 weeks, and I'm off the grid. And you know, when I started programming and being off the grid meant you didn't have a landline that I could call. There were no cell phones. That's dumping. The other way drives people. So you know, that's you dive in and you feel like you're drowning all the time. The other way is you feel like you're being driven all the time. You're being micromanaged. Delegation. The two rules of thumb that help me with delegation. One is a Russian proverb that was said by Lenin and Ronald Reagan. Anybody know what it is? Trust but verify. I heard that back there somewhere. Yep.
Is that what it is?
Trust but verify. That's a Russian proverb. And the other, so I use that to help remind me to delegate. And the other rule of thumb that I found useful was from a guy named Alan Lefkoff, who headed up Utopia, a company called Utopia, for 8 or 10 years. And he told me he learned this rule of thumb from Lou Gerstner, when both of them were McKinsey consultants. And this one is, I inspect what I expect. I inspect what I expect. So these other two here, don't be a motivator and don't be a motivator. Now you would think, these are 4 things you have to learn as a new programming manager. There's a 5th thing. First of all, you would think these two were the same thing. And the fact that they're not is the 5th thing, which is you need to learn. You need to be ready to learn how to be a manager in ways that you never expected. I never expected as a programmer to read a single article from the Harvard Business Review. I'm not sure I even knew what the Harvard Business Review was. But in the early 90s, when one of my Apple colleagues gave me a Harvard Business Review article, I was about 5 years into managing at that point. And I had a whole bunch of ahas at that point, but this was a huge aha, and it was the aha that motivators and demotivators are different. What motivate people to do stuff and what demotivates them and causes them to leave your organization are entirely different. And the guy who wrote it was a guy named Hertzberg. We've got, Hertzberg basically said that there are fewer things that motivate people than you think, but there's an equal number that demotivate them, and they're different. And so this is a chart, and this is going to be hard to read, so I'm going to walk you through it, so don't get nervous about it yet. And it's this. So we've got a couple of charts in the book from Hertzberg directly. They show what in broad audiences are motivators and demotivators. We took that and applied, this is what Mickey and I think, that if he had applied it specifically to programmers, this is what it would look like. So the blue bars are motivators. These are things that motivate people, and it's ordered in that order, obviously, going down. The red ones are demotivators. These are the things that cause people to go crazy, cause programmers to go crazy, because that's what this chart is. So look at what causes programmers to be happy. Making a difference in the world. We think that drives more programmers than almost anything else. And as a programming manager, what's your job? It is to connect the work that people are doing with the company's mission, with making a difference in the world. It's that direct connection that causes people to feel like they're making a difference. Secondly, learning and growing, giving people opportunities to learn and to grow in their jobs. Toys and technology. Anybody know any programmers who are into toys and technology? Recognition and praise. Having fun. Upside. Now, upside is like stock options and opportunities for bonuses and stuff. First, notice this is the 6th. We're down the scale 6 times before we get to anything related to compensation. The next one is interpersonal relationships. The relationships programmers have with other people in the organization, only then do we get to compensation. Now let's look at, so I have to look at my notes here to do this the other way because I didn't order it the other way. The demotivators. The number one demotivator is respect for your supervisor. Most programmers don't go somewhere because they respect their supervisor, but they will sure leave for lack of respect for their supervisor. What's the second one? It's lack of having fun. Now there are a couple of them that match up. So lack of having fun, which is this one. These are close. And the next one, which is learning and growing. If you don't get learning opportunities and growing opportunities, and you don't have fun, if you're a programmer, you're likely to leave. But then the next one after that are working conditions, which is over here. Here, working conditions and company policies and administration. Nobody who's a programmer joins a company because of their company policies and administration and working conditions, but they'll sure as hell leave if they're frustrated by them. And then after that is ethical management, and only then, 7th on the list, compensation will cause programmers to leave. As long as people are paid adequately, they'll neither be attracted or detracted by it. So I don't have time to flip this chart or to show you where it differs from Hertzberg's across the board general thing, or to share with you the other 2 theories of motivation that we found and we talk about in the book, or the warnings that we issue regarding using compensation as a motivator. Because there's a lot of studies around how you can totally screw up motivation of a team by trying to use compensation in that way. But the point today is to pull back the curtain on the tightrope that programming managers walk from a motivational and demotivational standpoint. So then I want to talk about continuing on motivating. Be careful about what you reward. Here are 3 rules of thumb that are related. Behavior revolves around what you measure. How many have had an experience of that? Yeah, and you've got to watch side effects of what you measure. You think you're measuring something? Well, I'll get to that. Here's a side effect. Firefighters who get rewarded carry matches and start fires. Do you define done as coding complete or as features that delight customers? So if the rewards go to last-minute heroism, why would you ever see either teamwork or consistent delivery across the period of a project? I said earlier that Mickey and I both believe that recruiting is a programming manager's most important job. In fact, it's a rule of thumb for us. If you are successful at hiring, the rest of your job will be immensely easier. If you are unsuccessful at hiring, you will have a plague on your team for months. You'll demoralize the organization. You will undermine your leadership. You will incite dissension and strife. You will delay and derail deliverables. Not to mention how hard it is to get rid of the wrong employee. Talk about that in a minute. So we've seen the time commitment that it requires to hire lead programming managers to not do that, to not focus on it, and to delay their hiring. So one of the challenges in giving it the priority it deserves is the fact that regardless of the size of organization, there are hiring windows, and hiring windows that open and close. So how many people have had a wreck and not been able to hire against it? How many people have had a hiring rec open, suddenly go rushing forward to hire against it, and have the window slam closed before you were able to get it done? Yeah, almost the same hands. The challenge, this is why it's a rule of thumb to always be recruiting, to be checking with your network, to go to industry meetings, to network and network and network, to have a Rolodex an electronic Rolodex of potential hires. I walked into Razorfish, managing the California development organization of Razorfish, and in the second week, somebody from upstairs who was in design came to me with a Microsoft resume. Now, all of what we did at Razorfish at that point was Java or open source. I looked at this resume and said, wow, this is a great .NET resume. I can't use it, but it's a great .NET resume. I created a new folder. I put that resume in there. 3 days later, one of our biz dev guys came and said, could we do a .NET program? We got a customer that does .NET. Boy, was I happy about having saved that resume and not forgotten about it, not said, no, we don't do .NET. The programming managers are always recruiting. The other reason that hiring managers hesitate is the possibility of making a bad hire. And the thing that you have to realize is that every manager, I was almost at the gloating stage of how good I was as a hiring manager after about 3 companies. So the 4th or 5th company I was working in had a guy come through, hired him to manage my QA organization. And absolutely the wrong guy. He had all the right words. He put them together in the right way. It took me 2 months to realize how wrong he was, and I was building up the case to do an intervention at the point at which he walked into my office, lucky for me, and said, I don't think I'm in the right organization. Let out a sigh of relief. But that happens, and it will happen, and you can't avoid it, and you've got to make hires because that window opens and it closes. And when you get a problem employee, you've got to deal with it. So most programming managers think that there are 2 things you do with problem employees. One is to fire them, and most programming managers won't do that, or they'll be desperate before they do that. And the other one is, and it depends on, so the answer to that, those 2 things, is what HR allows you to do, because HR generally doesn't allow you to fire anybody anyway, and you have to put them on a plan. But if you get to the point of a plan without having done an intervention, you're not doing your job. So an intervention is something that's way before a plan. It's way before, you're talking to HR, but you're doing it way before that. And you're having, it requires a lot of preparation. My mentor, Marty Brownstein, has written the book on it, Handling the Difficult Employee. if you don't know how to do an intervention, get this book. And then if you don't know, get some coaching around it. But handle problem employees because your team knows that they've got a problem employee who's part of the team. They know that, and their reaction to you, to seeing you not deal with it, is that either you're an idiot or you're not doing your job. Because they all know that there's a problem employee there.
So how are you defining intervention?
How do I define?
Yeah.
What?
How do you define intervention?
How do I define intervention? So intervention is a meeting in which you deal with the critical thing. There are several. It's a very defined meeting that starts with what's going wrong and goes from there to less a description of what's going wrong than the impacts of what's going wrong. Because what Marty found and what I found is that if you deal with impacts, people have a lot of, they find it easy to argue with, well, you do this. No, I don't. But you say, well, the rest of the team has this reaction when, or I just spent 3 days preparing for this meeting. That's an impact. And they can't argue with the impacts. So you go through the impacts. Now you go into let's brainstorm how we fix this. And Marty's claim to this process is that if you do that well, and the commitment is the preparation for it, the meeting itself, which is by far, I schedule half days for that meeting. I tell the employee that it's an hour long, but I schedule a half day of my time for that because they take that long often enough. And then there's follow-up. You brainstorm what the resolution is, and you have to follow up as a manager. But Marty claims if you do that, that employee will either buck up and fly right, or they'll quit.
And it has to happen.
And you'll never deal with the performance plan or the hiring.
And it has to happen very close to whatever the behavior is that's driving the team crazy.
At the point at which you're dealing with a problem employee, it's not a behavior. It's the behavior is consistent enough that it's seldom. You need to have been giving some feedback along the way, but it can't be a surprise. Just like no performance review should be a surprise. No one should be surprised by performance reviews. So shielding your team. So this gets called a number of things, being a deflector shield, protecting the team, a cone of silence, like the cone of silence. Bring it down and let your programmers operate in a cone of silence so that they're not interrupted. Or being an umbrella, and as the manager, holding an umbrella over your team's heads in such a way that all the stuff, all the maelstrom of corporate politics that are going on, they can look outside the umbrella sometimes and see them, but they're not being rained on. Right? They're not getting it. It's not hitting them. And if you're really good, they won't even know that it's going on out there. So I was at Schwab and I had one of my programmers come to me one day. He was 22, but he was a very senior programmer. And said, I don't think our team needs a manager. And I thought, wow, let me think about that. A bunch of very senior programmers. They work really well together. They work well with product management. They work well with project management. They deliver stuff. They do really good code. It's a great team. And I thought, you guys have no idea what I've shielded you from inside the Schwab organization. No idea. That's why all organizations have managers for programming teams. The challenge is being a conduit for the mission and the passion and the strategy and not blocking that part out so that you can latch onto the passion of the organization and its values while shielding them from all the politics. Joe Kleinschmidt, who was a CTO at Leverage Software, called it being a damper to the noise. So these are two truisms and also rules of thumb that are pretty general to, not true of just programmers. The most important person in your organization is your boss. And it doesn't matter what you do, it matters what your boss thinks you do, what the rest of the organization thinks you do. It's all about perception. And particularly as you move out of being a programmer into a manager, whatever role it is that has the word manager on it, there are only two of you who got away with not having the word manager in your title tonight. Particularly if you have the word manager in your title, it's all perception. Not what you do. You have to manage spin. You have to communicate that much more. So managing out and up, because as you move up in the organization, this is another one of those truisms, as you move up in the organization, when you're a programmer, all of the people on your team are programmers. They're all like you. They may have different, no, they do have different personalities. But they're all programmers, at least. They all do what you do, some way or another. As you move up in the organization, suddenly your peers are product managers and project managers and marketing people and HR and staffing, and you got financial analysts sometimes who works with you, and at some point your manager is not technical and either doesn't remember ever having been technical or never was. I had a programmer once who had been an expat in France, and he had gotten good enough in French that when he came back, he could translate, and he was hiring himself out actually in moonlighting, to translate technical documentation from French into English. Wow. He was really good. And he said, with all of that, I never got the jokes. I never got the humor. It wasn't that he never got them, but it was more than half the time he wasn't getting the humor when he was in France. I've had that experience. I've had the experience being at the conference table with the CEO and the head of marketing and the head of sales and not having a clue what those guys were talking about. They speak a different language. They speak the language of their tribe. They don't speak the product language that everybody in this room at least has in common. Even if you don't have programming language in common, you have product delivery language in common. You put some salespeople and a CEO who comes out of that background in a room together, and that's a different tribe and it's a different language. And they will pressure you to do really stupid stuff like micromanage your team, or to report on and prove to me your team is productive. They come in at noon. They don't look like they're busy. What are they doing all the time? Or, you should fill your team's plate to capacity. Man, they don't have enough to do. So let me talk about a couple of those things. Productivity. This is a nugget of wisdom that we captured. The Apple leases team managers. So everybody know who Bill Atkinson is? One of the great early programmers on the Macintosh software stack. He was also a programmer before that on the Lisa, and he wrote a lot of QuickDraw, the graphical system on the Macintosh, and before that the Lisa, and the managers decided to measure productivity by lines of code. And Bill Atkinson was bristling at this notion because he was about to go rewrite QuickDraw, and rewriting QuickDraw led him to remove, he got QuickDraw, I think an order of magnitude faster by removing 2,000 lines of code. And he promptly reported that he'd written minus 2,000 lines of code for the week, proudly. And he should have been proud of that, because that was the right thing to do. There is no measure that, there's nowhere that I can find any measure of productivity other than a programming manager's gut feel for their team. It's not lines of code. It's not story points. For those of you who do Agile, it's not story points, because story points differ from one team to the next team to the next team. They are specific to the team. Velocity is specific to that team. It's not, it cannot be measured across teams. And furthermore, if you do that, remember that rule of thumb about being careful what you measure, it will cause programming teams to change how they assign points to stories in the wrong way, in the wrong direction. Now, there's one possible exception to this. There's one thing that I'm investigating, which is stories. It's possible that you may be able to measure productivity in terms of the number of stories completed. And the interesting thing about that is that it's the one thing that customers care about. Customers don't care about lines of code. They don't care about points. Managers do. Crazy, dumb senior managers care about that stuff. So they're not thinking about customers. You need to redirect them to think about customers. Customers care about stories. What's the side effect of measuring productivity in terms of stories? The story is smaller. You can get more of them done. What are you trying to do with stories? Make them smaller. This is good. It has a good side effect. It's possible. I'm not sure. I'm not going to swear to this, but it seems possible. Now, capacity. Let's fill our team up to capacity. They're not busy enough. Now, take a look at this picture and tell me which of those two streets you want your pizza delivery to come on. There's something that pizza delivery and software development have in common besides feeding programmers late at night. Because that is full to capacity, but it's not moving. And that has lots of capacity, but it's moving like crazy. And there's something very common between those two things. So what bedevils managers? Micromanagement. Micromanagement drives programming managers crazy, even programming managers who are micromanagers get driven crazy by managers above them who are micromanagers. Requirements. So let's talk about requirements for a minute. So requirements that are too detailed. So I talk to programmers a lot and I say, how many of you have ever gotten a 400-page set of requirements? And some of them will admit that, okay, it was only 250 pages.
25,000.
25,000 pages.
25,000.
Yeah.
I don't know who will ever deliver it.
So
They have to be verified too. It's not just the requirement. You have to come up with the verification cross-reference matrix for all 25,000 and then attest to it.
programmers don't have any passion around getting big sets of requirements. So the next question that I ask programmers is, what percentage of that stack of requirements did you actually deliver? I get numbers, so once in a while I get a ringer. I get an engineer from NASA. I get something in the 95 to 97% range. Without exception, the numbers I get, other than that, are 15 to 25%. 15 to 25% of requirements are delivered. So, I mean, this is the case for Agile, and you know, if you haven't gone through it, you're going to go through it for 2 more minutes. Because I want you to think about the waste of the remaining 75 to 85% of those requirements for the product manager who wrote them, for the testers who developed test cases for all of them, for for the project manager who put together a project plan to deliver all of it, for the programmers who attempted, some of whom attempted to read all of it and comprehend all of it, and none of whom, I have not yet met a programmer who could maintain an understanding of all the interdependencies in a programming document longer than about 25 pages for the period, let alone for the length of the project, which for 25,000? 25,000 has got to be 5 years.
It's longer.
Or longer, yeah. So how do you remember all that stuff? So, in an agile case, you put them together in stories, they're only a sentence per feature. You prioritize things, they bubble up to the top, then you get the detail around them. So I'm gonna stop selling until they get a lot of heads nodding. The other thing, though, that happens with agile is, and I was talking to an SVP of engineering from Schwab, but he'd moved to a startup, and he said, our product managers say, we're doing agile now, they don't have to write anything down. They don't have to tell us what the requirements are. They'll just have a conversation with it. Au contraire. That drives programming managers crazy too. You need to know what the next 2 weeks, what it is your people are delivering. If you go to acceptance test driven development, sorry, ATDD, that's what it's about. How are we going to test it to a detailed level of what it is we're delivering? Requirements that are not prioritized. So there's a Jim Highsmith spoke at ALN a couple of years ago and just gave a wonderful story. He'd been doing, Jim Highsmith's one of the agile gurus, and Jim he'd done a CRM development, and his customer had 100 features that they wanted developed. And he said, okay, so great, my team's ready, give me the 3 most important ones, we'll do those in the next 2 weeks in our first sprint. And customer said, no, they're all important. All 100 are important. And he said, I understand all 100 are important, that's okay. It's okay, we'll deliver them all. We'll do them all. We just have to do them, some at a time. And do the first 3. Tell me what the first, went back and forth. But eventually he got them to get the first 3. And then, it was a little less hard each time. He did the next 3, they get to 15 and 18 and 21. They get to 21, and the customer said, we're done. We're done. This is good enough for the users. They're going to be ecstatic with this product. And we've got bigger fish to fry. We've got stuff that your team could be working on that's a different product. We're going to take them over here and stop working on this product. One of the things that happens when you do 400-page requirements is that everybody in the organization knows that that's not going to deliver for a year and a half or 5+ years. So you better put the whole kitchen sink in there. Because, if you want something, you better get it in there. That's how it works when you do that kind of stuff. Increasing requirements without adding time. There are no zero-time programming tasks. You solve that, you can solve that in Agile. Agile solves it by saying scope is the thing that moves. And in Jim Highsmith's case, it moved all the way down to 21 and a whole lot shorter project than they expected. Fixed scope with arbitrary deadlines. Again, Agile is a great solution because if you're going to have an arbitrary deadline, then let's see what we can get done and get done well with quality and test it against customers until customers are happy with it. Interruptions. How many people think that multitasking is a great way for programmers to work? Okay, good, I'll stop there. Arbitrary, counterproductive rules. I didn't bring it along, but I have a 3-minute exercise that can prove how counterproductive multitasking is. You can do this in about 3 minutes with your organization, so we'll talk about that in Q&A if you want. Arbitrary, counterproductive rules, let's not be stupid. How do we focus on collaboration? Roadmaps. Roadmaps, in my experience, I keep tapping the microphone, sorry about that, Nick. In my experience, there are 3 roadmaps that are important for every organization. So roadmaps are important in agile organizations because they point to where you're going. So if you think about, I want all of you to think about when you learned to drive a car. When you first went out driving a car, you were going down some road that had lines on it, and you were looking right over the edge of the fender, and the car was going back and forth, and you were steering, it goes a little bit this way, you steer that way, it goes a little bit that way, and pretty soon you learn that you look about a quarter of a mile out, and you stop doing this crazy back and forth thing because you can see where you're going, and you get there. The roadmaps are valuable for that. I won't go into any more about the value, but there's 3 of them. One of them is an operational or infrastructural one that needs to be written around your hardware and how you're going to do that, and how you're going to build it out, and how you're going to do failover, and how you're going to do backup, and all those kinds of things. That's not my bailiwick, but they're really useful. And the other 2 are my bailiwick, which are product roadmaps and technology roadmaps, development technology roadmaps. Product roadmaps and development technology roadmaps are best developed in sync. On the technology side, they have to do with technical debt and fixing that, with architecture, with architectural underpinning that needs to be done, with crufty parts of the application that need to be fixed, with opportunities that developers see for features that can make a difference to the product side. This is a frick and frack kind of, we're buddies here, product manager, program management kind of deal. And similarly, product managers need to think about technical debt and risk and factor that into, it's not just, so I just about said, it's not just about customer value. Identifying and responding to risk is about customer value. And integrating the customer value of risk and technical debt and with the customer value of features is the key collaboration point. Prioritization, that's what we were just talking about. Listening to customers, this is something that programming managers and product managers should be doing together, that the whole team should be doing together. I was an early member of the CHI, Computer Human Interface group of ACM, and one of the conferences in the early 90s, back when the Macintosh, back when Microsoft tends to follow Apple by about 10 to 15 years, and they hadn't yet caught up, so it was back in that era. And we were at this conference, and they were handing out buttons, and the buttons said, "We are not the users." The people at this conference were the people who were designing the UI, the user experience, and they are not the users. They are as close to the users as you can get, they're not the users. And for sure, programming managers aren't the users, and programmers aren't the users, unless it's Atlassian's team. And the rare exception to that, there are some of the users, however, they are users who are clued into how the code works, so therefore they're not the users either. But they're closer to the users than any other programmers are. Avoiding wasted time. Yeah, we've talked about wasted time, but it's a joint challenge of programming managers and product managers. Reducing complexity and making software that customers love. And I have a great quote. This one's from Joe Kleinschmidt, who was the VP of engineering over at Leverage. He said, "In the beginning, everyone will talk about scope and budget and schedule. But in the end, nobody really cares about any of those things. The only thing they care about is this. People will love your software or they won't. So that's the only criteria to which you should manage." That's a shared criterion. So, there's not enough time in this session to go deeply into culture, but I want to say a couple of things about it. One, that companies, there may be a difference between what your company says and what your company does, and you need to recognize that. Programming culture and corporate culture, there's seldom a perfect match. As a programming manager, creating a programming culture, you will have to wall parts of the corporate culture off, and you will have to create parts of your programming culture that don't exist in your corporate culture. But wherever you can, you need to leverage the corporate culture. You need to leverage the words of the corporate culture, even if they're not lived up to. If the corporate culture has a word like teamwork, that's a valuable word and a valuable one to leverage. If it has one like fairness, even if it doesn't feel fair in the rest of the organization, that's a critical word for programming cultures. Programmers, we'll go back to the motivators and demotivators there. They care about that. Juanita Ma, who's an engineering manager of the South Bay, said, publicly reward or acknowledge engineers who act in a way that supports the culture you want to create. Communicating is one of those places that's a difference between programmers and programming managers. The level of communication that you accept from programmers is close to zero. The level of communication required to be a good programming manager is way higher than that. Sometimes it's how programming managers are chosen. You're a good programmer, and oh, by the way, you've got some people skills. You be the manager. It's important to create a culture of communication at every level and in every direction, in the whole breadth of the organization. And I love Kimberly Weefling's rule of thumb. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use them in that ratio. It was actually said in Roman times. I can't name the guy who said it, but it was slightly different wording and slightly less succinct, but a wonderful quote. Wonderful rule of thumb we quote in our book. What would happen if you were to form a mutual admiration pact between the product manager and the programming manager in your company? What would happen? One, you'd see a lot more collaboration, a lot more communication among them. In some organizations, there would be a huge surprise for the rest of management. In some organizations, right after that, there would be a huge sense of fear. Some organizations try to keep us from working together because they're afraid of the product organization juggernaut that would happen if product managers and programming managers work together. And in some organizations, there would be a sense of relief. And in all organizations, we would be helping each other manage up and out. So I wanted to share a few closing rules of thumb with you. Tim Swihart, who was an engineering director down at Apple, said, if you're a people manager, your people are far more important than anything else you're working on. Ed Catmull, who was the CTO at Pixar, my co-author had a development of development tools at Pixar, said projects should be run like marathons. You don't sprint the entire 25 miles. You sprint at the end. You may sprint a couple of times in the middle, but you set a healthy pace that you can do the whole thing. You talk to team and training people, a lot of them will alternate between walking and running through that whole marathon and go faster than when they tried to run the whole thing. It's that healthy pace.